All right, good evening. It is 5:37 now. Sorry for the late start. This is the regular monthly meeting of the Urbana IDOT Traffic Stop Data Task Force. And it is Wednesday, October 15th, 2014. Would we get a roll call, please?
Sure. Patricia Avery. Andy Charles.
Here.
Shinjini Chattopadhyay. Nicole Anderson Cobb. Alejandra Coronel.
Here.
Eric Jacobson.
Here.
Will Kiles. Peter Resnick.
Here.
Chandra Somerville.
Present.
Paul Testa.
Here.
All right, seeing a quorum, thank you. And I will remind folks to turn on and off your microphone both directions. Coughing loudly is very exciting on the TV set, I'm sure. All right, so can I get a motion for approval of the agenda?
I move we approve the agenda.
All right, do I hear a second?
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Eric Jacobson, second by Paul Testa. Do we have any discussion, any changes or additions to the agenda we need? All right, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, that carries unanimously. Approval of the minutes. We have minutes from the September 17th meeting. I hope folks got a chance to glance through them. Do I have a motion for approval of the September 17th meeting minutes?
Yes.
Okay, the motion by Shinjini. Any second?
Me. Second.
And a second by Alejandra. Any changes? Anybody notice any corrections that need to be made in the minutes? Great. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
All right. So we have approval of the September 17th minutes. So moving on to our old business, which is our standing agenda item, which is subcommittee reports. We start with the statistical analysis. Paul, do you have any updates for us?
Nothing to submit to the board, but we've just still getting some updated and revised data to address questions from last time. So.
Great. Again, I appreciate the amount of work you put in last time. It was fabulous. I fear that every time you bring something to the task force, we're going to come up with 20 more questions to ask you. I take that as a sign of good work and apologize for all the additional work we're making for you. Great. So look forward to more next month on that. We have the Police Procedure and Public Engagement Subcommittee. Nicole is not here. Andy, you're on that subcommittee, are you not?
Yes, and one of the things that I did this month is I looked at the statistical packet from a police perspective and looked at some of the items that stood out to me, and there were a number of items, but there were a few of them that I wrote down and thought I'd bring back and throw out for the committee's consideration. One of the points that was brought out was there was a census block portion of the statistical evaluation, and it showed the census breakdown of the city of Urbana. And I looked at that, and it seemed to make sense with my experience that of where the more heavily populated areas with different racial backgrounds were. But then I looked at that and overlaid it with the crime map for the city of Urbana that's available on the public website for the city of Urbana, and looked specifically at the geocodes, or the small broken units where we had more than 100 crimes reported, and those crimes are not city ordinance violations or traffic violations. They're actual crimes, or state of Illinois laws that are reported broken, and we take a report on. And those areas seem to overlap with the highly African American populated areas on the census map. And so I was talking about possibly looking into more detail in those areas, what the ratio of victims of crimes in those areas are or reported races of suspects that were known in those areas are, compared to the percentages of stops in those areas, and seeing how that would affect the disproportion of stops that's made in town. So we're talking about the areas. There are actually, let's see, 11 geocodes, which is basically 10% of the geocodes in town that had over 100 reported crimes. And in that 10%, that's where the police officers are sent the most. That's where they would hopefully be spending most of the time, because that's where most of the reported crime is. And just by presence, is that affecting the overall numbers? I believe that the information is fairly easily attainable on those crime statistics, and I'm sure there's much more detailed data than I was working with, but it seemed to be something that jumped off the page.
Any comments or questions for Andy on this? Yeah, Eric, please.
Well, I guess I had asked to be circulated, and I guess it was the report from Riverside, California. And of course, what you're, the line that you're pursuing is very consistent with that. I guess I can talk about that in a little more detail when you get to Social Studies Committee, but I'm kind of encouraged that we're perhaps converging on the same line of thought within the committee, and maybe even some convergence with Mr. Cruz.
Yes, actually, in reading the Riverside report, it's along very similar lines.
And any other questions or comments? I'll certainly bring up again when we get to the social science portion, the book that's been mentioned. I got my copy last week, the pulled over book, and I've only gotten partway through. I've been neck deep in hundreds of pages of technical work. And when I'm done, I'm happy to pass it along to the next person. One of the discussions, and we've had this discussion in the committee before, was this question of safety stops versus investigatory stops. Is that a breakdown that you and Paul can make in the data? That you can you tell the difference in those concentrated areas between those sorts of stops? Because that does seem from, again, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but that does seem like an important question of what the relative numbers of those are.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. That's very important, and I don't know within these geocodes if we're going to be able to break that as easily. The step data, if we, and Paul indicated that he's been working on trying to get that, and maybe not getting all of it yet, but the step data is going to tell us that's going to be a significant portion of those traffic safety-related stops. And most of those areas are going to be concentrated outside of these higher crime areas. They're focused on a completely different issue. They're focused on where are the accidents and injury accidents and significant injury and fatality accidents in the city, and trying to identify those contributing factors and affect those contributing factors. So most of the area, they may overlap, but they're not going to necessarily be in the same areas.
And that's an interesting question that just popped into my head anyway, is so there's the department is sending someone out in order to do safety stops for a particular purpose.
Yes.
There's the department sending someone out in order to do investigatory stops for a particular purpose in this area. And is there a third category of maybe, I don't know what to call them, happenstance stops or something like that?
I would say that would be the low-hanging fruit stops, basically.
Okay.
It's the what happens right in front of you and you can't ignore stops. But yeah, the department does have a specific traffic program where officers are assigned to go out to those areas where we could try and impact the traffic issues. the closest thing the department has to anybody that does the investigatory type stops would be the street crimes unit that is assigned to specific problem locations or problem people to try and affect them. You know, when a neighborhood calls and says, this house is a disturbance to our neighborhood, usually the problem lands with street crimes, and they're left trying to have some effect on raising the quality of life for the people in the neighborhood, and that would be the closest thing to a unit that did that type of stop.
So I know I chatted with Nicole after the meeting last time, and she's developing or trying to develop a list of questions about police procedure that might inform us. So hopefully she'll get a chance to watch the recording of this meeting, but either way, we'll definitely pass these kinds of questions along, and maybe that'll inform her list of things that we have to ask the department directly. Yeah, Eric.
So I'm wondering, Andrew, would it be feasible to have the ticket, the information on which a stop is recorded, to be coded as to whether it's a purely traffic stop or whether it's an investigative stop? I guess I can understand, I can see two aspects to this. I understand that it's kind of, you know, it's sensitive in the sense that many people have argued and do argue that giving police the ability to do investigative stops can be abused. But the other side of the coin is that the other side of the argument is that investigative stops are a legitimate investigative tool that in principle, although in principle they could be abused, also in principle they can lead to solving crimes that would otherwise not be solved. So, and it's the law of the land. The Supreme Court says, yes, as long as there is some technical violation, equipment or traffic violation, yes, it is okay to do the stops. So in all of that context, is it, do you think it's feasible from, you know, policy point of view, technical point of view, to code stops as to whether they're purely traffic or whether there's an investigatory component?
Yeah, I think that that's a possibility, and I think that one of the things that you're getting at, or that I'm getting from this, is that, and something that I really feel is that part of what we should be doing is not just establishing what can be done by the police, but establishing what it is that the community wants to be done. And because the police should be reflecting the community. If they're not, there's a problem. If we're not reflecting what the community as a whole is wanting out of the police department, then that is an issue. My feeling from interaction is that when people have something affecting the quality of their life in their neighborhood, they want the police to have an effect on it. But they don't want to be inconvenienced at the same time, and I understand that. So I think we can code these. I think that's a possibility, that we could devise a way to code the citations as, you know, to look at motivation for stop. And I think that you're right. There are officers that may be skeptical, but I think that it's something that can be done, and it might give us some good insight.
Any other questions? Thank you, Andy. All right. Moving on, we've got our Community Impact Subcommittee. Patricia isn't here tonight. Who's been working with Patricia on this?
I am.
Okay. Anything to report?
There
of
is no
yours?
report. And, but one of the things that I'm being considering about the community impact, having a conversation with Andy, and, and this ongoing about, okay, if it's a crime, this is a social economic status, and I think that we need to kind of find out why this is occurring. I mean, this is just because of those geocode, or, those neighborhood that they have some issues, and how we can, because reflecting other cities, or it will no answer our questions in our local neighborhood. And I think that if, with the help of Paul getting all this geocode, and and also getting the traffic, and why is this being, why is the reason that it's been happening, I think that we can find a way of communicating with our community and find out the ways how we can assist those neighborhood and learn and teach them in a way of how to avoid a traffic stop, or find out what those traffic stop is being occurring. Because if we have, low income, and I will say as simple as a stop, because you don't have a current sticker. Well, this is a traffic violation, and this is an issue. And it's gonna be stopped no matter what. But if this is a problem that is affecting the community, how we can approach the community in a way of, well, if we don't drive, we will more likely not be stopped by police. Or how we, and I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but the idea is, if we can find out the reason and why it's occurring, and we can actually bring tools in our community and be able to avoid those traffic stops that have been occurring in different neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. Yeah, in any event, any questions or comments regarding this? I know we're going to talk at some point about the direction of the report, and I think this plays into it. I'm interested in teasing apart the things the community can do, the things that the police department can do, and to a certain extent, and I'll talk about this when we get to the announcements, how the social impacts are playing against these particular ways that we're interacting right now. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate that. And so no other questions? Moving on to our social science subcommittee. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just had one. I had the opportunity to sit down with Ms. Avery this afternoon, and she actually asked me to pass on some information that one of the things that she would like to see sort of as part of the subcommittee would be hearings on community impact that would give individuals from the community an opportunity to come and talk about various impacts, such as financial impacts, psychological impacts, social impacts, cultural and community impacts of sort of the disparate number of stops. And I guess I'm putting this in her words, but I think what she'd really like to do is have those occur sometime before the November meeting. And I think we can probably put that together. I think she'd like to do it here in the council chamber. So
I think that's a great idea. We talked about this a little last month.
Right.
I think we should try and give a couple of opportunities for that to happen, if we can. Clearly an evening would be most helpful. If there's possibly a weekend during the day that we could do it, that might also be helpful. I think we want to get as many folks in here as possible. People have work schedules, people have families, and so try and make it as available as we can. But I think that makes a lot of sense.
I just needed to pass on that message.
Yeah, that's great. Any other comments or questions before we move on? All right, Eric, social science.
Yeah, so I passed on to you the study from Riverside, California. Riverside is a city that's significantly larger than Urbana, but otherwise maybe in other ways maybe somewhat similar. They had similar racial disparity in traffic stops, and they did the geocode analysis, and and then they coupled the geocode analysis with an analysis of calls for service. And they, in calls for service, they tabulated the calls for service according to the race of suspects or the ethnicity of suspects who were identified in calls for service when that was possible. And the conclusion that comes out of the statistics is that their racial disparity, it looked pretty compelling that their racial disparity was explained by the racial disparity in the areas that were being patrolled and the racial composition of not only the residents of those areas, but with respect to the racial composition of suspects who were so identified in calls for service. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in my note is that an explanation is not a justification, and that I think that, and they didn't go as far as I would like to have seen. I think the justification for the stops may be explained by the racial composition of suspects and the fact that the stops where there was a racial disparity were in fact investigative stops. But then the other issue, another serious issue, is were those investigatory stops effective in solving the crimes that were reported or the problems that were reported? And I would like to see us, I think we're on track to do the kind of analysis that they did, but I'd like, if possible, if it can be pulled out of the records, I would like to see if the if we can figure out the results of those stops. To what extent do they result in an improvement in the rate at which the problems and the crimes are solved?
Comments or questions for Eric? Yeah, Andy.
I know that we would certainly have pages of anecdotal
Right.
data that said, on this stop, we stopped these people with guns that said we were going to kill these people and you stopped us.
Mhm.
That's happened in Urbana.
Okay.
But then we compare that to the people that are inconvenienced by this, and I think that we can, maybe going through like the street crimes unit would be a good way now to look at some of the solutions that they've implemented, and we could get maybe some data on crime rates in an area before and after they focused on an area. That might be something that's helpful. And when we talk about things like Riverside and is it effective, I think that we have to differentiate. When we talk about the police department, we have to differentiate between what our philosophy is, and is that on target, and how is it being carried out? Is our practice where it needs to be? Because those can be two different things, and it fluctuates. But I think that we can certainly get some data on some small areas and at least small sample size data, I think.
The thing that I, hope will come out of this, however we impinge, however the results of our study impinge on police practice, however they impinge on the on how individuals in the community interact with police. I think that I don't think it would interfere at all with the effectiveness of the police work and would really help in the community if the rationale for whatever the practices are and the policies are is very transparent. And I think that's, I think we've gone a long way in, the discussion of distinguishing between purely traffic stops and traffic stops that have an investigatory component, because there's a violation, otherwise you can't stop them. But the motivation may be investigatory primarily. I think we've gone actually along. Certainly, this is something that I did not come into this understanding, and I think that I have at least some understanding of that now, and I think that the community, I think at the end of the day, it'll really be important for the community to understand that, so that whatever our police practices are, the community will understand why they are what they are, and that motivation is a good motivation.
One thing that I would point out from Mr. Cruz's communication this month, which I think is worth you looking into and maybe doing a layup for either the statistics folks or the any of the other committees. There are apparently a number of studies cited in the pulled over book about the effectiveness of investigatory stops. I think those are worth looking into and seeing if that can be informative, and also some on actual, social impacts. But I think those are definitely worth going through.
Yeah, I have purchased the book. I haven't dug into it yet. Yeah, so I will.
Appreciate
I will.
that.
And I thought that Mr. Cruz's accompanying communication was very, in many ways, was very insightful.
Yeah, I found it very useful. Anybody else on the social science questions? All right. Seeing no new business on our agenda, we have time for public input. Anybody wish to address the task force this evening? Sure. If you'd like.
We would be shocked if you didn't.
Although
I'm looking forward to the day where you don't necessarily have to do that.
I do want to reiterate, the communication this month and the pointers were great. I am embarrassed that I haven't been able to get through the book yet, but the information you gave us and the pointers were incredibly useful, so thank you.
Well, I must thank Paul for mentioning the title of the book, because it did.
And please use the microphone.
Yeah.
And introduce yourself if you would.
I'm Darrell Cruz, 2007, South George Huff, Urbana. And I think that after the data presentation last time, one of the things, and I'll start with that, once I kind of reviewed that and went back home, it looked fairly consistent with what I kind of gathered and put together and shared with people the last 10 years, except for one aspect, and I did send Paul an email, and I don't know what the answer for this is because it is extremely intriguing, and that's pages 10 through 12 when they talk about searches at traffic stops, because the data that's reported to the state, I believe, is basically only technically has been consent searches and dog sniffs, and yet you look at that data that Paul had in 2004, there were like 400 searches associated with traffic stops. It's decreased to roughly 200, but I've never seen, and I don't think the public has been aware of, what that implies, and I have a question or two, and I see Sergeant Charles is wanting to possibly explain that maybe.
I don't want to cut into your time, but
That's
I
fine. Well,
did
hopefully we get
actually
another minute.
look at that when I read your input. And I think we're talking about apples and oranges, so we'll explain what the apples and oranges are. What we've traditionally looked at and what's been submitted to the state is consent searches and dog sniffs. What I believe Paul was reflecting in the statistical data was also searches subsequent to arrest, probable cause searches, inventories. There are a number of different searches that would fell into that category. So, for example, the searches that were reported to the state were the searches where somebody came up to a car and there was no probable cause to believe that this person had committed a crime. And yet the officer still said, based on some other information that didn't rise to the level of probable cause, said, hey, I think you might have a gun in your car. I think you might have drugs in your car. I think you might have alcohol in your car. Do you mind if I search your car? Or we're going to run the canine around your car. So those were the ones that were reported. What was not reported was the officer that walks up to the car and sees liquid bubbling out from underneath the seat and can smell beer coming out of the car and says, get out of the car, we're going to search it because I think there's open alcohol in there. Or they walk up to the car and there's an odor of burnt cannabis coming out of the car. Or you go to an accident scene and the driver of the car is carried away from the scene by ambulance, so they don't know where their car is going to go, so we complete an inventory of their car and a tow sheet for the car. That's actually a search. Let's see, what else falls into that category? Probable cause, inventory search, searches subsequent to arrest. So you go up to the car, the driver of the car has a revoked driver's license or is DUI, and you arrest the driver and you search the driver and car subsequent to arrest. That's another type of search that wouldn't have normally been reported to the state as a search. So that's the discrepancy in those numbers, I think, that we're seeing.
And I think that's described as such in the book, the types of activities that can occur as part of a search that is done. And I think that's important to keep in mind, though, okay, because that's part of the experience that can occur during a traffic stop. And generally, at least from what they're suggesting in this book, is those types of things, the great preponderance of them occur during investigatory stops and not generally just during traffic safety stops, because although they can occur during a traffic safety stop because it'll pop up, they occur as part of an investigatory stop. And an investigatory stop isn't just a search. In their definition of an investigatory stop, it can be questioning. Just, why are you driving in this neighborhood? Why are, what are you doing here? Where are you going? In other words, an investigatory stop doesn't necessarily have to entertain a search of the car. It can be a search of a person. Ask the driver just to get out and pat them down if it looks like they're suspicious, if they have something on their person, okay? Or handcuffing them and having sit on the curb while you conduct a computer investigation, okay? There's all types of things that are part of an investigatory stop that may include just the simple thing of questioning to as far as, pat downs, car searches, handcuffs, and et cetera, and then getting hauled off as part of it. And the interesting thing about investigatory stops is generally, and you can read the book, okay, is that they are generally done as explained because they're institutionalized practice, because we have this understanding that there are high crime areas and we have certain understandings of how to fight crime. And so when you get a call and somebody says we may have a house here dealing with drugs or something of that nature, that begins to build an impression of how we can use traffic stops to also fight crime. And you can do that through using traffic stop techniques to do that. Now, the book also goes on and suggests that one of the things is that this is because there's a special training procedures And I'd be curious as to, you know, whether that's a policy and if they're trained in this method, because most police departments are, because there's technique and style of how officers conduct themselves in investigatory stop, and how those particular types of questions occur and how people are targeted, because they're suggesting that it's not done without racial bias. They are racially disparate, okay, according to this book. That's what is causing it, okay? Investigatory stops are constitutionally legal. They explain and go through the explanation of that and how that is done by law, is to be made legal. But there's 2 points that they make also. And one is that from the data and research, and they quote several reports, is this really an effective way to fight crime in the long run? Not just, you know, because you can pick, you know, I just read an article in News Gazette today where they stopped somebody and found a loaded gun under the front seat. That was an investigatory stop in some way, okay? And maybe that was good or bad, finding that gun. But all of the investigatory stops over a period of time and who's influenced by them and the effect upon the people and the community in which those stops are occurring, how does that affect the relationship between the police and that community, and how does it ultimately affect fighting crime in terms of what type of cooperation you get from that community when you ask them questions to help, when they say they won't snitch, they won't trust, because there's a whole another dynamic that goes on that they're suggesting that this particular tool in the long run over time defeats the purpose of fighting crime, affects a certain population in our community in a negative way, and creates unintended consequences that does not serve the enforcement of law or the benefit of community safety, even though you can find these little cases where it works. And so I would encourage you to go ahead and take a look at the book and read it. It's current. They have some documentation of some reports. The data is very parallel to what we have here. And to understand an investigatory stop is just not searches. And I don't know if they can code it out, because if an officer just comes up and asks you, where are you heading? All of a sudden, that becomes an investigatory stop. I've never been stopped for a traffic stop and asked that question. I've always said, did you know you were speeding? Did you know you forgot to turn your turn signal on? Did you know you were going too fast? And I get a ticket or a warning, okay? That's not, that's what most Caucasians think when they think of traffic stops, and that's what they understand the experience to be for everybody. That is not the case of what's occurring in communities across the country. And so I think you're moving in a good direction, and this book may help share some information and understanding the dynamic and the policies and institutionalized practice. And like Sergeant Charles says, I think the community should have a say. And I think the police are doing what they're doing because they're professional and they're thinking they're doing what the community wants. And now we have an issue, maybe we need to step back because we see some unintended consequences, and it's time to take another look at it.
Before you go back, any questions for Mr. Cruz at this point? Andy, please.
I just wanted to say that some of what's described by you as a investigatory stop is not what happens here. Now, I'm not saying it's not what happened or described in the book, but I'm not sure what the date on the book is, but there have been a number of court cases in the last 5 to 8 years that have limited significantly how many questions or what kind of questions can be asked on an investigative stop. And then there's some of the things that have never been legal or practice here, like removing somebody and handcuffing them from a car without a probable cause for arrest, or searching them without an articulable suspicion that there's a risk of, or frisking them without an articulable reason. So there are a number of things that, you know, while we read a credible study from another location, aren't reality here. And one of the things that we have to combat, and is that more than personal conduct or contacts here, television and hearsay influences how people react largely to the police, more than personal contacts do.
One of the things that, and Mr. Cruz's questions, many of them he mentioned tonight, but he had a few more in his communication. I think it's well worth the subcommittee kind of going through, sort of identifying what sorts of things do we do here, what sorts of things don't we do here. One of the things that I think having some folks here to talk about impacts will get us to if there are any anomalies that we can find out from the community. So I think that would be good. Any other questions for Mr. Cruz? Yeah, Chandra. Oh, I'm sorry. Eric.
Yeah, Daryl, do you think that officer body cams, in addition to car cams, would possibly help would help the situation in whatever way you want to interpret that?
Well, I hate to give a definitive answer on that because I've read some information from the ACLU and the NAACP regarding their positions on body cams, and I don't have a strong opinion yet one way or the other because I think there's some civil liberties that apply to both the police officer 24. If you have a body cam on that's constantly on, I think there's some issues that may inhibit good policing, yet I understand the value of body cams in situations when the public or some documentation is needed. So I don't have an opinion on that yet. I would like to withhold. I think that's a good thing to maybe talk about. I know Patricia has a strong opinion on it, and she may bring that up as maybe thought for the committee to include as a recommendation or not. Ultimately, I'm not sure on that. But so I don't have an opinion on body cams yet, except I still want to learn more.
Although it sounds like you do have some pointers to some ACLU or NAACP text that would be useful for us if you could forward
if
such
you're
pointers.
Interested, Patricia has the NAACP. I have,
yeah.
and Eric, probably has the ACLU, but I saw it. It's the federal office. I think put something out to the state departments, and at the last ACLU meeting, they talked about. I had gone to it, and they talked about it a little bit. And there's a statement on body cams and
if you
their
could
position on it.
dig
So
that up,
it's
Eric?
easy to
Yeah.
get
Yeah,
the ACLU from their website.
I will take it as social science to get as much as I can on body cams, both ACLU, NAACP, and then there perhaps are some, scholarly studies on the impact of those, although they're relatively new. But I'll try to dig out as much as I can. I mean, I think you've alluded to the issues. There's a privacy issue on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's an issue of improving transparency, and how that all balances, I guess, is why people spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Can I make one quick comment that what Sergeant Charles had mentioned about, in line with the book? The book does not just have statistical information that it's compiled, it also has anecdotal narratives that it is collected in a scientific sort of way, okay, to gain a personal perspective of an individual's actual experience. So I think Mrs. Avery's suggestion about possibly having some public meetings, or the ability for the public to come and respond to, because what happens between one-on-one, between an individual and that officer, sometimes those narratives shed a light that data doesn't shed on. And what it is it's what you're experiencing, what you're feeling, and maybe what's occurring that really isn't supposedly part of the training or official policy that does occasionally occur out on the street. And people can only share that through narratives. It never shows up anywhere else. And the book acquires some of that data through narratives in a very interesting way and uses that as a secondary source of information that's very informative.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And actually, that points to one thing, just before I forget it, that when we start talking about bringing folks in to do some presentations, we might also want to give folks the opportunity to do written materials if they want to do that, so that we can have contributions if folks can't make it or they would prefer to spend some time writing it down. So when we arrange, that would be great. Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Oh, were there other questions? I'm sorry.
I guess that this actually isn't a question for Mr. Cruz. It's more a question for
Well,
Andy. But
and then let's hold off on it because I
Okay.
want to give other people a chance. Any more questions for Durrell? Great, thank you. And is there any other public input? Good evening.
Good evening, Martel Miller. He had said something about they don't do something in Urbana. And I know of two things that happened in probably in the last 2 years. One happened to me on Race and Illinois Street. I was walking down the street, police pull up on me. First thing he asked me is where I'm going. I asked him, do he need my ID? Second thing, he asked me where I've been. I asked him again, do you need my ID? Because I knew what he's doing. That's an investigative stop right there. And I'm very experienced what goes on with the police department. He didn't take my ID, and I think me holding him up for a minute, and then I asked myself, are you gonna stop these people across the street? It's like 3 Caucasians walking across the street. I asked him, are you gonna stop them and ask them where they going or where they been? And from that conversation, he pulled off. And that was just a couple blocks away from here. And I seen a young lady get stopped one night. And the police got up to the car. He said she didn't have on her seatbelt. But when she wants to get her ID and stuff from, she unbuckled her seatbelt. And this is in the dead of night. This ain't like and when the sun out. I don't know how he was able to see her seatbelt out on from behind. And then she had her 15-year-old son in her car. Her 15-year-old son is 6'3", about 300-some pounds, but he's 15. He goes and say, I need his ID. But he stopped her for not having a seatbelt. So if she broke the law, why would she need her ID? And then she told him he's 15. He tells her he don't look 15. Does he have an ID? And then he asked and gave her name. Then about 3 other cars came up, and I asked to talk to the sergeant. I was talking to the sergeant. Then the officer come up and said that, I'm trying to think, I taped it on my phone, so I got what he said. I can't remember right now, but he's saying the reason he had to asked him for his ID because that's what they are trained to do when there's other people in the car, to get their information. So if you haven't, here what I don't understand, if you haven't did anything wrong, it's the driver that broke the law. Why is the passenger and other people in the car needs to get the ID? And I had an experience from Champaign when I got stopped with minorities. They asked everybody for ID. When I was stopped with the Caucasians, they only asked the Caucasian for the ID and then asked everybody in the car for the ID. And I know them practices go on because I didn't experience them. Mm-hmm. And I'm just want to know when them practices stop. Y'all don't stop people and ask them questions, because I probably can get some witnesses that it didn't happen to them in Alabama. Is this something new?
No, it sounds like you have some very limited anecdotal data. I would not know what happened without looking at the individual stops and what the circumstance was, what the officer was looking for.
The one stop tapped it down started at Goodman's, having the Taco Bell, and it had to be, because I came up here, I talked to a sergeant up here, so it should be some record.
Before you continue, Andy, one of the things that we set up front as far as order of the committee is that we don't want to get into long conversations with public input. But this, to me, is important information, and I don't want people on the task force sort of getting into a big thing here. Insofar as you've got more specifics that you can contribute to the committee, I would like you to submit them to us, but I do want you to finish your input if you can.
Okay, when you're trying to get information from African American folks to bring to committees with their name on it, they look at it, it could be maybe repercussions. And I may try to get these names, but I can probably get the experience in the days that it happened. I've been talking about racial profiling for about probably the last 8 years. And I'm going to tell you how I got to talking about racial profiling. And we were doing a mentor, trying to get, we started a mentor thing for the at-risk kids. And when we were out talking to them, hear what they told us: we don't need no problem with need no help with our school right now. We need help with the police. And what they were telling us, I was telling them they was at the wrong place, wrong time, around the wrong people. But what we actually went out and seen was, I call it police misconduct. They see a group of kids, they pull over, and then they start interacting with them, then they take their name down, and then they would run them for warrants and stuff like that. And they wouldn't have to be committing a crime or anything. It'd be them standing somewhere as a group, walking somewhere as a group, and it would happen. And it was happening in the King Park area, and it was happening over there in the Ellis Drive area. And that was probably 4 years ago when we were doing that. So these things do happen, and they're still happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you leave, any questions for Mr. Miller? Thanks. And any information you can, I'm sorry.
Not a question, just a comment, and that is, that the one thing, and this goes back to the body cameras, the in-car cameras, the audio input, and that's that whether it's an officer and a citizen, or two officers or two citizens, whenever we're trying to listen to what happened in an event, very often everybody involved tells the absolute truth about what happened, and their accounts are very different. And it took me several years to be able to reconcile that and understand that somebody can tell the absolute truth as what their perception of an event was, but they only know a portion of the story. And so I think that there has to be and that is the good thing. While I know that there would be officers, and myself included, working a 12-hour shift, wouldn't necessarily want a body camera on the whole time, because that's a long time of day, half a day at a time, to be scrutinized. But that is the good thing about audio and video, is that when you look back, almost everybody involved looks at it and says, boy, that's not exactly how I remembered it, but I see it, so that's how it happened. So I think that when there's input, you have to look at both sides of something to get a true picture of what's happening.
Okay. Could I say something about the body cams? I agree with the officers having body cams, especially when they come in contact, like when they stop the car and walk up to the car and see what the conduct is when they reach the people in the vehicle. Because what the audio catch and what the cars catch, I don't think it'd be catch that personal thing when they reach the vehicle. And so I'm agreeing with body cams. I think they really need it, and especially since what happened down in Ferguson, they are really needed to tell the whole story. Because sometimes the person that could tell the other side of the story is no longer here. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Any other public comment? All right, thank you all. And as I mentioned before, anytime you can bring stuff in whatever form to the task force before the meeting, so we have a chance to digest it and can discuss it, that's always appreciated. All right, moving on to our next item, staff report. Todd, is there anything to mention?
You know what, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. During the last meeting, there was discussion or a request for data that would show some type of distinction between the reason for stops and the reason for citation. We made good progress on that, so by the end of the week, I think we're going to have a good amount of that data, working with our IT department. Also, there was a request for financial impact data. Now, I don't think that we're going to be able to merge that data or bridge that data with the IDOT data that shows, for instance, racial demographics. But I do think that we're going to be able to get the financial impact data that basically will give us some idea of the residents of the individuals that are being stopped. And so we're going to be able to map those onto sort of the geocodes to see the impact in terms of money that's coming out of specific neighborhoods and communities. We're going to try and de-identify that as much as we can, but I think that we can get that down at least to the block resolution. I think that's it. Oh, and the pulled over books, I think we ordered them. I need to double check to make sure we ordered some copies for people. And once we get those in, I'll send out some type of announcement to everybody.
Terrific. Thank you. That's all exceedingly helpful. Yes, question?
Couple of comments. The first is, so did we make any formal request for population data at the geocode level? I don't think we actually did, right?
I've pulled it.
Oh, so you already have it.
I've pulled it from the census
From the
data,
census,
but
yeah.
that is at the beat level and needs to be
Yeah.
merged in. So that's.
So I was wondering whether Todd could help with that. Like, do you have population data at the geocode level or not?
No, we
really?
don't have it by geocode. So
okay.
if you have some ideas on exactly how we could go about getting that population data, the demographic data, we'll go after it in terms of
Because-
getting it down to the geocode.
Because the census level is at a higher level, it's not going to help us.
Right.
But I think we really need to have the population data to do any sort of statistical concluding from there. So maybe Paul and I should brainstorm about this and get back to you about that.
Great.
The other point I wanted to make was that, so actually to you, so I think that if there's sufficient number of limited anecdotal experiences, then it becomes systemic. So, I think one is to recognize that. And the second thing is that narratives, as you said, are very different, like with the same situation. And the third thing is that often people don't tell the truth. I mean, I have had a police officer lie on the stand when I challenged. She lied, perjured herself on the stand. So, I think that we need to keep that in mind, and possibly something to address in the report as well. The fact that narratives differ and the fact that people don't always tell the truth. And especially after Ferguson, regardless of whether we say that, yes, there is prejudice or there isn't prejudice, I think that there has to be a way, perhaps we do want to think about whether there has to be a way of verifying people's stories, whether it's body cams or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, and I do want to apologize. Thank you for, I should have given the task force another round after public input before I went on to the staff report. But yes, Eric, please.
So I'm moved to wonder whether if, when we have hearings to get input from the community, I wonder whether it would be useful to also have at the same time some sort of police response about, what kind of situations, what kind of situation from the police perspective might lead to the kind of behavior that's described. We won't be, we're not going to pair up the officer with the person. But on the other hand, there's a sort of class of situations that might arise from a policing point of view, and why would, for example, is there a reason why Mr. Miller might have been stopped and questioned that is an actual legitimate, policing perspective, and whether that might or might not pertain to the particular incident he's describing, but at least to open a dialogue where both perspectives are introduced, and where there can be a dialogue about those perspectives. It, in my opinion, might be useful if the committee agrees with that.
Alejandra?
Well, I agree with you, because I think this is something that I suggest to Patricia when she brought it up, the idea of bringing public hearing. But more as a matching, I will suggest that we can ask the input of what is the experience of an officer and what the stop is occurring, no matching anybody, because otherwise it will be a hearing here, and it will be very tension for everyone to tell what is the perception. But if we got the public hearing and we got the input of the community members, and we can also bring in the officers and tell about any specific stuff that it doesn't need to match, and we kind of establish a rule to our audience and say, this is not going to be an argumental fight or or discussing or disrespecting anybody, but as we as a community member, we have a perception about how people interact with us. There is another view of the officer, why they interact in a certain way that we as a citizen, for not having any training, we don't know why they are responding in a certain way. And I think that will be helpful to hear from both group.
I think there's something to this, but Eric, you said at the same time, and I think that would be terribly confrontational to community members coming in to talk about their experiences. Having a separate hearing or some presentation from the police department, I think makes a lot of sense. Maybe setting up some roundtables in the future, but to have a hearing where both are presenting seems like, I don't know what you might think on that point.
I think there's a risk of that, but I think there's also a great possibility for a gain. I'm thinking back to one of the biggest sort of confrontational things we had on the city council. Brought out many people on both sides of the issue, was the proposed panhandling ordinance. People were passionate on both sides of that. We had people who felt that this was absolutely essential to their safety, and we had other people who felt that it was absolutely, an outrageous infringement on individual liberty. And we had some tension, but I think we worked through that to a really good resolution. And I guess my hope would be that would be the case here, especially if we laid out the ground rule that, let's say, if we laid out the ground rule that this was not to be a confrontation, it was to be a discussion in which both sides would actually listen to the other. Both sides would actually try to understand the perception of the other. Maybe it would be, I don't know, I have some faith, or maybe not faith, I have hope, I guess, that this really could be done and that it would be a good thing.
Andy?
I've had a lot to say already, and she hasn't, so.
Chandra, please.
Done a lot of listening. I would like to encourage us to think about the balance of power if that chooses to take place. Because of the lack of trust between people who may be coming to report on the hearing, as well as police officers that may not be ready or prepared to even hear at the time. I think that we need to be in a position where we both can balance out the power for both parties. So if there is someone that's on the opposing side versus the police, I think that it's our responsibility to be able to hear the community. And it's also our responsibility to be able to hear the police. But I definitely think that it could cause some type of power struggle, and I would not support that type of meeting at this time. Now, afterwards, and we hear both sides, then I think coming together would be more appropriate.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you've crystallized exactly what was going through my mind. I think what you all are talking about is something different than what Ms. Avery was proposing, which is to gather that information. And I do think that that balance of power issue, the police are, just by dint of what they do, an authority. And I think it would significantly affect the information we could gather. On the other hand, as Ms. Somerville said, I think a second interactive, more discussion-oriented forum after we do some of that collection of information might be very useful and very interesting. So, yeah, Andy, please.
I'd like to put a little bit of perspective on part of this, because every individual interaction with the police is always significant for somebody. Or at least that's actually kind of how it's set up, is that if you have a police interaction, it's supposed to be a significant event in your life, or at least a formal police interaction. But they're also, I think it's important that we put in perspective that there's also a cost. When we talk about what does the community want from the police, there's a cost we say the community is not trusting. Well, there's a certain amount of that on the police side too, and it's important that it's realized that for the police, there's no extra bonuses for making stops. For a young officer, if a young officer came up to me and said, aside from looking in the mirror at the end of the day and saying, well, I think that overall this may have helped make this a better community today, what's my motivation for stopping people? And there really isn't any other motivation. You open yourself up for criticism, you open yourself up for review and second guessing. You are going to be wrong eventually. Hopefully you're right more than you're wrong, but you're going to be wrong. And there's absolutely no upside other than the fact that you can think, perhaps this made this a better community by enforcing the rules of the community. So if as a community we want that, we have to be mindful of how much questioning or how much accusing we do, and we have to put in perspective how many stops we're talking about. In the city of Urbana, in the highest year reported here, we've averaged 12 and a half stops a day. That's in a community of 40,000 people, we've averaged 12 and a half stops a day. To put in perspective how many cars go through the city of Urbana, IDOT's most recent study of 5 Point showed that 25,700 cars in a 24-hour cycle a day, 25,700 cars go through 5 Points. And we stop 12 and a half cars a day. So how much impact we're having right now, I would question. And I don't know what the community wants. I don't know if the community wants this much impact, more impact, or less impact. But it's pretty easy to discourage the police from having any contacts because there's no benefit for them. There's no personal gain. And it's a little bit harder from a police perspective to encourage a young officer to go out and mindfully go about their job and try to have positive contacts and positive influence on the community.
Yeah, Chandra, please.
So of those 12 and a half stops, I think where we may be coming from, and I think the purpose of the task force is to look at, are those stops disproportionately on one side or the other? So I think that that's more of the purpose of looking at, yes, I do recognize that here in our community of Urbana, we definitely do have a lower amount of traffic stops, and I get that. I think what the question is, maybe, is it disproportionate? And I think that's what we'd have to look at as a community and be able to hear.
And I think we've discussed, how can we be better and how can we examine this to make sure that if it is disproportionate, there is a reason, a legitimate reason that it is, and we're accepting as a community of that, or are there things we can do differently? And I agree completely with that. But we get to a point at some point where if you're only stopping 12 and a half people a day, more of the things, when you talk to people in the community and everybody has a story, more of that's anecdotal that happened. They heard it happen to somebody else's, they heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody, or they saw it on TV, not it really happened to them.
Absolutely.
Any other comments?
I think staff was looking to say something.
Since it still is staff report agenda item, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I always agonize because I'm not really supposed to have an opinion. So I guess the one thing I would say is this: it depends on what you're looking for in terms of your hearing. If you're looking to try and identify and address systemic issues, right, what I would recommend as sort of from the staff perspective is to have people be able to come in, the community come in, and basically provide as much anecdotal information as we have time to take. And then you can take that information and give it to police administration and ask them to formulate some type of response, which will be sort of targeted towards their priorities, will be able to help us understand their sort of enforcement strategies within the context of what's been brought to you. Because it may not, many of these things may be happening at the officer level, but if it were just a couple of officers, we wouldn't be seeing the trends over the years that we're seeing. And so it seems like there may be some larger strategic issues that have more to do with police administration and the philosophy that we're taking as a community than just sort of individual impact studies. Or that's, yeah.
If I may, I would take that as wise advice, although it is different from what I was suggesting.
Any other comments from folks? We are officially to our announcements. Are there any announcements that people want to make? I did want to use this portion to mention two things. First, I don't know how many of you caught it, but I did get interviewed by the News Gazette a few weeks ago regarding traffic stops. The direction of the story was a little different than I would have expected, but my response was mostly the task force hasn't come to a conclusion yet about what we think about these things, but that we are looking broader than just what the number of stops were and what the racial disparity was, but also the impacts of those stops. And I think those points got across. I always warn people never look at the comments on the website, but of course I broke my own rule and looked. Some of them were disturbing, and they always are. But some of the even disturbing comments gave me some ideas about certain questions we're going to be asked when we produce the report, and therefore certain things that we might want to pre-address and nip in the bud. So if you have a chance to at least look at the newspaper article, I don't think it was unreasonable, and I think it characterized my comments reasonably. If you dare to look at some of the comments on the website, you may, but we can talk about those as we get to the report. The other thing I wanted to use the announcement time to mention was I talked to a couple of people after the meeting last month, and I had a personal reaction. I thought we had a good discussion. Some of it got a little tense, but I think the outcome was good. But it led me to two things that I wanted to mention. One that I mentioned, I think, at the beginning of the task force, which is this is a rather serious business. I know that when I start talking, as I did last month, about the statistics, I get very wound up in the technical, and oh, those numbers are really interesting and cool, and I think we do all have to remind ourselves that the nature of people's lives in this community are really at stake in this discussion, and sometimes I get a little caught up in, oh, that's a neat number, and recognizing that it really is about the people in this community that we're doing this, so we should all be careful about how we're expressing ourselves. And the flip side of that is sometimes I know we'll each give a report and other people will have reactions, and we'll say, oh, can we do this? Can we look at this other thing? And I do want to make sure that people recognize that their work on this committee is very much appreciated. Sometimes we also get excited about new things for you to go off and do, as I did to Eric several times tonight. I think we should just be careful, not only in our asking those questions of people who've given reports, but also in when we give reports, to make sure that we understand that people are not being critical, but are getting excited about the process and trying to find out the information they can. Just as a reminder, I think we're actually on a good track in asking the right questions, but we are humans, and we do need to be careful of those things. Any other announcements or comments? We're looking right on time. I will take a motion for adjournment. And a second?
I'll second that.
I have a motion by Chandra, a second by Eric. Any comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? Thank you. We are adjourned.